The Center for Procurement Excellence is a nonprofit member organization with a mission of educating, promoting, and advocating for better RFP processes. Join CPE today and make your RFPs faster and more transparent. Membership also includes discounts to all of our training and networking events. CPE hosts a variety of virtual and in-person networking and training events throughout the year. Visit our website to get signed up. CPE Speakers Bureau is available for your regional and national meetings and professional conferences. Contact us to learn more.
Welcome to Ask the RFP Doctor, CPE's monthly web series where we discuss the latest best practices in procurement and supply chain management.
So today's topic is understanding procurement protests, the who, what, and why these happen. And if anybody's ever been through a protest before, we have a shared experience, right? I've been through, not a lot, I've been through I think 2 or 3, but it can be extremely stressful. And there's certain things that we've found that works well for this and things to just keep in mind here, right? So today's agenda will go through perceptions of a protest, how that's interpreted, what that means, the roles and purposes of that, and then finally, how can we think about how do we avoid a protest, right? We actually want to avoid protests at all costs, and we'll talk about our opinion, our perspective on how to actually do that. So when you think about some of the pros and cons of a protest, there's some perceived downsides to this, and typically this is from the procurement standpoint of what don't we like about protest. It can delay the procurement and award processes. Many organizations, if there's a protest, everything stops until that gets resolved or potentially canceled, depending on what can happen, right? We sometimes think, well, protests are only those that are sore losers. They're never going to win in the first place. They file a protest. And so we don't like that because, just accept it for what it is. Or perhaps owners may punish the vendors on future projects. So if I'm a vendor, I'm worried that, I'm somehow, my integrity is in question here. And so therefore we're concerned about that, right? So these are very commonly, when we think about a protest, these are some of the negative sides of what we typically experience when we think about protest. On the other side of this is that, what are some of the benefits or why do we have this in the first place? One perspective is that it helps to hold the owners accountable, meaning that if we as a procurement organization or buyer do something that's either not legal or not what we said we would do, there's a venue to actually provide an option to provide a protest and raise the issues that might be happening with this. So this helps maintain integrity. At the end of the day here, what it does, it provides an opportunity for the vendors to validate that the owner is following their policies, right? And that's the spirit in which protests are meant to be set up here, right? So there's different perspectives and different approaches in terms of how we think about this. Now, the way we protest and the methods by which we protest vary largely by the organization. So just provide some general ideas, or if you've never been through this before, this might be beneficial. So again, it's very specific. Typically, there are deadlines when you can protest, and if you miss those deadlines, then there's nothing you can do about that. A common mistake I've seen by vendors is not submitting within these deadlines. There's typically 2 deadlines: protesting the solicitation, so the actual solicitation or RFP document before proposals come in. The second deadline is tied to the award. So the owner announces we intend to award to whoever company, and there's an amount of time, typically 5 to 10 days after that announcement is made, where you can protest. And I have seen numerous projects where folks try to submit a protest and they can't because they missed that time frame. So that's just something to keep in mind here, that if we are going to do a protest, there are certain rules and regulations about how we do that and when we do that and the impact of them. Now, to kind of kick things off here a little bit more, I have a protest story, and this actually happened in Arizona a number of years ago. Now, for those of you that don't know, Arizona, and I think Florida now, I think Arizona and Florida are the only 2 states that do not recognize daylight savings. So I grew up in Arizona, and now I live in North Carolina, and so getting used to daylight savings for everybody else that does that, it blew my mind, right? You got to spring forward and fall back. It's crazy, right? Anyhow, Arizona does not recognize daylight savings time. So on this particular project, I was actually there. We're collecting the bids for this project. It was, I don't know, about $40 or $50 million worth of furniture and different things related to that. So it was a furniture contract. In the room, about an hour before the deadline, there was a vendor sitting in the corner, and she was writing down a sheet of paper who submitted and the time they submitted. So she was making a big list of everybody that submitted. What's interesting is that as she was sitting there and asking the procurement people, okay, who was that? What time? Okay, thank you. She wrote it down, made a list. As she was doing that, guess what other vendors started doing? They all sat down and they wrote down the times and dates as well. They weren't sure why they were doing that, but everybody started writing down the dates and times of everybody that submitted. Okay, so fast forward here, they make the award, or they announce the intent to award, and one of the vendors, the person writing down all the times, filed a protest. And here's what they said. We requested that the individual who opened the bids during the public opening read the timestamp when the bids were received. On April 6, 2009, Phoenix was Pacific Standard Time, so bids have been received prior to 2 p.m. A list of those bidders, we made a list of those. Therefore, proposal received after the time and date for closing will be returned to the proposer unopened. This action did not occur, requesting that all proposers submit their response after 2 p.m. PST, Pacific Time, be disqualified. Now, as we know, Phoenix and Arizona, most of Arizona is in Mountain Time. In other words, they always stay in Mountain Time, they never adjust here, right? So as procurement, just to think about, sometimes you have protests that don't make any sense or just not aware of the actual rules and regulations. And this is the procurement officer's response, basically a summary of what happened. The greater Phoenix area is always on Mountain Standard Time and is never on Pacific Time, except for the changes. And then they close it out. If you wish to appeal this, and I actually laughed when I saw this, if you're going to appeal this protest, you have to establish through evidence and not through assertion that somehow the greater Phoenix area was not using Mountain Standard Time, right? So it's kind of crazy, right? Protests are not always like this. Typically, they're much more focused on not following process and procedure, and there's somehow, something fair that, potentially is not going on here. So let's take a minute here and just briefly go through some of the broader data about protests and what we see here. There's the federal government's, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, and they collect data and evaluate all sorts of things. Many of you have probably worked with them before or are familiar with what their work is. But basically what they are is what we might call the quote unquote congressional watchdog. So they ensure that the government is spending funds appropriately. They conduct analyses and third-party oversight, where needed to make sure that things are going according to plan. This next chart here, what I'm going to show you is about 12 years of procurements and the number of procurements that were protested since 2001. So in 2001, according to GAO, for the projects they looked at, we're at about 700, and about 12 years later, we're north of 2,000, right? I pulled up the most recent data, and that trend has continued to go up here. So what does this mean, and why is this happening? I think there's a variety of reasons here. I think one of the biggest reasons is that just the litigious environment that sometimes we live and work in, right? Just the nature of filing a protest, that's what happens. We see that more often, right? But more importantly, I think really what's going on here is the fact that us as owners have processes that are not necessarily fair and open. And when people don't know what's going on, I totally agree with that. What they should do is file a protest if we don't understand what is actually happening. Now, we can avoid all that if we explain to folks, here's what's actually going on, here's our processes, and here's how we can avoid this in the first place. This next slide, what this shows is the number of protests filed and the percentage of those protests that were sustained. Now, this chart I think is super interesting. So we have, again, a increasing number of protests filed, but the number of those that are actually sustained is going down. Now, typically, who sustains a protest? Right? Who makes a decision that? It's typically the chief procurement officer for that organization. And if not, then they'll go to a third-party arbitrator or some other judge or some other third party that will make a decision about this. So what we see here is that we have more protests being filed, and fewer percentages of those actually being acknowledged or sustained as this is an issue. And again, I think what all this is pointed to is that us as owners, the way we manage our procurement processes frankly can be improved. Because if people know what's happening and they understand how we're being evaluated, the need or the likelihood to file a protest, I think, goes down over time. Now, that's up to 2014. I also pulled the latest data last 5 years. This is the effective rate. In other words, the effective rate is what percentage of protests are, acknowledged as there is something going on here. It is ticking upwards. So 46% 2016, 2020 was at 51%. And so again, since 2001, these numbers have continued to rise because there are concerns about how our protests are actually happening. So to kind of put a cap on all this and kind of pile this together here is, why do people protest, right? There's lots of reasons here. I think fundamentally, as Buzz Lightyear tells us, is that there's confusion about what we're actually meant to do here, right? There's a belief that we didn't do something right, or there's a belief that we said we'd do one thing, we did something different. There's a misunderstanding on what the requirements actually are. Now, one of the courses that CPE offers is a class about how to develop statements of work. And I know that several of you have been through that class here, but this is something we don't talk about on the class, but having an effective statement of work helps us minimize the likelihood of protest. If people know what we're looking for, and they also know how we're going to be evaluated, that makes it a much better experience for everybody involved here. So when we think about why companies protest, let's now tie that to, well, what are the common grounds for sustaining a protest? In other words, if somebody protests and whoever agrees that, yes, it is a valid protest, what are those reasons? Typically, what we have found by far the number one reason is we didn't do what we said we're going to do. If we say we're going to have these evaluation criteria and we don't use them, that's a concern. If we say we're going to use these weights, we don't do that, we change it, that can be a concern. If we somehow change the committees and what they're going to look at and the process they're going to look at that, that's definitely a valid reason to protest things, right? If we don't do what we say we're going to do, vendors, in my view, have absolutely every reason to file a protest because we said one thing and we did something different, right? So that's what we found here is by far the number one reason. Now, the title is up here. We know that protests are concerns. We know there's issues here. Let's really wrap this up and think about how can we avoid all this in the first place. And I know I sound like a broken record now. Brian and I talk about it all the time. The foundations of procurement excellence are how we stop all this. Fair, openness, transparency, value, and integrity. And for each one of these, I'll briefly discuss what this actually means and how do we get there, right? If you think about this, is that the industry thinks about your proposals, your RFP, solicitation, statement of work. If they have these ideas about, here's what we think about your proposals, the impact of that, of course, is less likely to propose, lower quality proposals, less competitive pricing, and really what we should do here, Brian, you and I should think about this, is add in another bullet that says more likely to protest. If people don't understand what's going to happen, this is what happens on the right side of us. So the way we address this, and I know it might seem germane here, but the answer, in our opinion, is to make sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to win. Now, that doesn't mean that we treat expertise the same. In other words, what I mean by that, let's say that I have a procurement process that gives the advantage to a high performer. Or in other words, if somebody really knows what they're doing, our procurement processes should be set up and structured that that type of company that really knows what they're doing has that advantage. That's what we mean here. What it doesn't mean is that we give somehow favor to somebody that we think might do a really good job, right? Everybody has an equal opportunity to propose and win the project. Openness, we tell people what's going on. We don't arbitrarily limit people who propose on a project, and we tell as many people as we possibly can about our particular project. Transparency, we tell people, here's what we're going to do. It's understandable, it's clear, we'll follow through on that. Value, and lastly, integrity, right? If you think about it, procurement are really the guardians of the public value. That's why we do this, and that's our intent of having an effective procurement process. We have found that time and again, that organizations that adhere to these principles are much more likely to have a protest, and really at the end of the day here is to become that client of choice. So that's kind of a high-level summary of here. One thing I do want to bring to your attention here before we do break out into breakout rooms, CPE is supporting a group called Simplar, an ongoing study about human dimensions and how that affects procurement teams. If your organization would like to be involved in the study in terms of developing a human factors profile of your team or yourself, reach out to Brian, send him an email at brian.lyons@simplar.com, and we have a free report that will go through and summarize those different things. Okay, so any questions or comments before we split into breakout rooms about protest and the things we should think about it. Anybody have any questions or comments? Or Jeff, if you're on the line, feel free to jump in here too with any thoughts or comments you may have as well. Questions or comments?
One of the main reasons that people protest is because they're surprised or they don't understand. And a lot of times that's because the evaluation criteria, even if they're stated up front, are very subjective. And so they think they've got a good chance, but they're surprised at the end when they get a very low score.
Yes, I totally agree. Yeah. If we're expecting one thing, we see something different. That is a concern, Tim. Thank you so much. Yeah, Nicole, go ahead.
Hey, can you go back to that GAO kind of trend list of?
Yeah, absolutely. We have this one here. Is this one you're thinking of?
I know the first one that you showed that had the columns. Yeah.
Yeah.
I find it really interesting because it looks like from 2001 to roughly 2006-ish, it was kind of steady. Anything happened in late 2005 that made a difference in the world?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, it's kind of funny. My dissertation work was about the Great Recession and how contractors responded to that. And there's a whole slew of things that we looked at with this here. But one thing that's interesting, this is basically when the recession, the Great Recession started, the housing crisis, the whole 9 yards, and we see a lot more protests happening. I don't know for sure what's causing this, and I would welcome ideas or thoughts about this, but I would guess here that at this time, at least in construction, the market was just completely decimated. I mean, there is thousands upon thousands of contractors that have gone out of business. My suspicion is that one of the main reasons why this happened is because our last resort here, we can't get any work, so let's just file a protest in the hopes that maybe this can turn in our favor. I don't have, this is just my personal opinion, I don't have any data to support that, but it's very much in line with how the recession kind of happened and what happened with that. But if you look at the previous data, it hasn't really gone down. It's kind of went up, and it's basically been sustained at that level.
I think
Yeah, Jake.
Because there is one company that started to thrive in that recession, and that's Amazon. In 2005, they started Prime membership. So I think it's interesting to see how much they jumped into the billions of dollars of revenue from there.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lori, do you have a comment? Go ahead, Lori.
Yeah, I have worked in the IT space for years. And I actually started working in central procurement for the state of Iowa doing IT related bids in 2007. So right before that happened. And the whole time that I was at central procurement, I probably had about 5 or 6 protests that I had to go through. And one of them was actually a 3-day trial, in-person, lawyers. It was held in one of the state buildings with an administrative law judge. But it was just like a trial. You had to swear in and sit up there and answer questions. And thankfully, in the end, the judge upheld our decision. All the appeals I ever had at the state, they upheld our decision. It just, a lot of times vendors will ask for the points. Like, I don't generally give like the breakdown of each individual requirement and the points in the final summary. I just give the final scoring for technical and cost, and then the total. And then if they ask for, the more detailed one, then I give it to them. And then what they want to complain about is their points, and they should have got more points for this or that. And, and thankfully, when I worked for the state, if we got a protest, we immediately turned it over to, we called it an appeal for the state, but to the Attorney General's office. And we had someone assigned to us who understood procurement rules and would call the vendor and try to tell them the judge isn't going to sit there and pick apart the points and they're going to just look at the process and what did you follow the process you usually use and was it fair and blah, blah, blah. So we never ended up losing any. But one thing that I learned during all of that was if the vendors are not getting enough business, then they're going to protest. But if there's enough business to go around for everyone, then they're just like, oh yeah, okay, well, we'll get the next one, or, things like that. So the economy definitely does play into the number of protests.
Absolutely. Thank you, Laura. That's really, really good points. Thank you.
This has been Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence.